What if I told you that a single two-word phrase from the New Testament could totally flip the script on the story of early Christianity? Well, today we're going to dig into this idea of the super apostles, a term that, for some people, uncovers a secret war for the very soul of the early church.
All right, so to really get to the bottom of this whole super apostle mystery, we first have to talk about a pretty popular idea that's floating around today. The idea that the early Christian church was, well, anything but unified. In fact, a lot of people think it was just a place of constant, deep conflict.
Yeah, the popular story you hear these days is that the first few years after Christ's death, they weren't about spreading one unified message at all. Instead, it was this total battleground of competing ideas. You've got apostles like Peter and James and Paul supposedly fighting it out for control, trying to decide what Christianity was even going to be.
And you know what the number one piece of evidence for this theory usually is? It's this one super dramatic phrase from the Apostle Paul himself. I mean, it sounds like a direct challenge, right? Like a shot fired in the middle of an internal war. But the real question, the one we've got to ask, is who is he actually talking about? And look, this idea of warring Christianities, it's not some fringe theory cooked up on the internet. No, it's a narrative that's gained some serious traction in modern scholarship, and it's all built on a very specific way of reading history.
So, the theory basically goes like this. Paul's brand of Christianity, that's the one that won the fight. In the New Testament, well, that's just history written by the victors, right? All those other lost Christianities, the ones supposedly taught by his rivals, they just got suppressed and totally disappeared.
And again, this isn't some obscure idea. It's been pushed into the mainstream by a lot of well-known scholars and authors. They all pretty much argue that original Christianity wasn't one thing, but a whole collection of different competing versions right from the get-go.
But this is where the plot really thickens. Because when you actually go and look at the writings we have from Paul's contemporaries, the other apostles, the evidence, well, it points in a completely different direction, a whole different direction.
So that brings us to the million-dollar question, doesn't it? I mean, if Paul was really in the middle of a doctrinal war with Peter, James, and John, wouldn't we see some hint of that fight in their own writings? Let's do it. Let's put their core teachings side by side and see what we find.
And when you do that, wow, you find something pretty remarkable. On all the big things, the absolute foundational doctrines like Christ being divine, the resurrection, how you get salvation, the authority of the apostles, there's just no disagreement. The earliest writings we have from these guys show this incredible unity on the core message. It's really stunning.
Okay, so if Paul wasn't fighting Peter or James or any of the original guys, then who in the world were these mysterious super apostles in Corinth? Who was he so fired up about?
Well, it turns out context is everything here. See, the letter shows that Paul was dealing with a very specific local problem in Corinth. These super apostles, they weren't Peter or James or John. Nope, they were these rival preachers, guys who had wandered into town and were basically trying to undermine Paul's authority, probably by bragging about their own spiritual gifts or credentials.
So the really crucial point is this. This isn't some big conspiracy about a lost Christianity being erased by the winners. Not at all. These teachers were just an isolated, kind of fringe group challenging Paul in one city, and their influence just faded away. Their story wasn't erased. They were never part of the established central leadership to begin with.
And check out this timeline, because it makes things super clear. The core unified doctrines that we see in Paul's letters, those show up just 15, maybe 20 years after the crucifixion. That's really early. Now compare that to these so-called lost Christianities, like the Gnostic texts, which had totally different ideas about Jesus. They don't even show up in the historical record for another 100 years or more. That really suggests they were a much later development, not some competing movement from day one.
So why do we care? Why does getting this story right actually matter? Well, figuring out this super apostle mystery gives us a way more accurate picture of the early church, and it's key to understanding what happened next.
Because this completely reframes the whole narrative. The Great Apostasy? It wasn't some immediate collapse because the apostles were all fighting with each other. Nope. Instead, it looks more like a gradual corruption, a slow loss of authority that only really kicked in after that unified first generation of apostles was gone.
So, here's the bottom line. The early church absolutely had its problems. It faced growing pains, opposition from the outside, and local disputes with some fringe teachers. The New Testament is super honest about all that.
But what it doesn't show is a big internal civil war over the basic fundamental nature of who Christ was and what his gospel meant.
And that leaves us with a pretty big question to think about, doesn't it? If the foundation of Christianity was actually built on a united apostolic testimony, well, that really forces us to reconsider where all the fractures and divisions we see today truly came from. And maybe, just maybe, it helps us understand what was really lost in the centuries that followed.